Yeah, good morning. First things before I start, this is the session about learnings from COVID for future resilience, right? And talking about resilience, I want to thank the sponsors, the platinum sponsors. So thank RGA, Milliman, and Accurate, okay, for their supporting the ICA. My name is Hitesh Shah. I'm an actuary. I live in Singapore. And I'm a member of council and a member of the management board at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Now, the reason we're here, I'm going to read out to you a little bit of the blurb that was on the session. So this blurb goes, much has been learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, with industries and societies now working out what living with COVID means. And you're all living it here, you're here. Before the pandemic, health experts around the world had plans, some of which were better than others in managing illness, the economy, and society. In this session, there's a panel of experts. They will look at what we can learn from the experience, both directly for managing future pandemics and indirectly as lessons for other crises and wider societal issues. They explore what others have learned, the importance of listening to experts, and how experts can work with policymakers to help make better decisions before and during a crisis. Right? So that's the official blurb for what we're going to be doing. So what they're going to do is they're going to share with you their take on experts. Now, actuaries are experts. We've got some actuaries here and some other experts over here. They're going to share with you their take on experts. And they're going to share the role of experts and what it takes to be taken seriously. Right? There are many experts, but how do you get taken seriously to actually have influence? They're going to share what they've learned, what worked, what didn't work. And they're going to share ways of working that are effective. Now, my question I had is, you see them here, right? And they are experts, they're acknowledged experts, but who called upon them first? How did they get to be where they are, right? I'm not talking about their education and all that, but how come they were the ones who were selected? How did the callers, whoever called them, how did they know where to look and who to ask? And then one final thing that I had before I sort of introduced the panel is, for me personally, I discovered quite a few heroes during the pandemic, right? Like I said, I live in Singapore, right? And there were some who you expect them to be, the doctors and the nurses, right? At the forefront, dealing with every day. But I was actually surprised. Communications people, communications experts. I mean, they turned into heroes, right? And Singapore, actually, it's ended up making the decision who's going to be the next prime minister. The better minister, the person who could communicate better, has now been anointed as the successor to the current prime minister. But the ones that really, really surprised me were the scientists and the actuaries. You're surprised to hear the actuaries because, you know, these two, the scientists and the actuaries, are not renowned for quick action, are we? So therefore, when the vaccines came out so quickly, right, and surprised. And then from the actuary side of it, I'm going to introduce Stuart McDonald, MBE. He's an actuary, and he should be coming up on the screen soon. A little bit about him. Stuart's the co-founder of the COVID-19 Actuaries Response Group. And he's the head of demographic assumptions and methodology as a partner at LCP in the UK. And he was awarded an MBE for services to public health in the 2022 New Year's Honours List. After you hear from him, you'll understand why he's one of my actuary heroes here. So, also with me on stage, I'm going to start first on my right, Dr. Nick Coatsworth. Many people in Australia will recognize him. Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Australia during the Australian response to COVID-19 and a practicing infectious diseases physician. Nick became one of the most recognized medical spokespeople during the pandemic. He engaged the Australian community through a variety of media platforms, most notably as the spearhead of the national COVID-19 vaccination campaign. Now, I'm not going to read the full story. It's on the app. please do read it, because I'm not going to do justice to them just by saying a few things here. So if you want to get a full picture of the expertise and what they actually did, please read the bios. Then I've got Maia Gould. She's the Strategic Services Lead at the ANU School of Cybernetics. Now, cybernetics, when I tried to read up on it, because I had to really read up, what do they do, right? It's fascinating. I mean, from an actuarial point of view, just have a think and have a chat with her later. And she looks at technology adoption from a human and earth lens perspective, right? And that can mean lots of things. Maia's got a Master of Bioethics. She focused on emerging science and technology, works with some of the largest professional service firms, issues such as mental health and corporate social responsibility. Now, that's just a little bit from the bio, okay? Welcome, guys, and I'm going to hand over to Stuart now, if I can get him on. Stuart, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Thank you. Welcome.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me here with you today. Really delighted to be able to join such a strong panel, and particularly to be able to give an actuarial a piece of insight and thoughts from a practicing actuary as to some of the different ways that I and colleagues have been able to get involved in the UK response, and you know, as I talk through that, can hopefully draw out some of the lessons that we've taken from the contributions that we made to the formal and informal elements of the pandemic response. If we can move to the next slide, I'm going to set out essentially the actions and steps taken by a few different groups. So I'll talk about the COVID-19 Actuaries Response Group. As Hitesh was just saying, that's a group that I co-founded. We can maybe talk a bit about how that came to be as we get into the Q&A and you know, what steps led to us coming together. I'll talk about our use of traditional and social media to put messages out, and you know, what the pros and cons of that were. I'll also talk a bit about the continuous mortality investigation. That's another actuarial team that's been very active in the UK through the course of the pandemic. And I'll talk a bit about the more formal elements of the UK pandemic response. So a team of actuaries working for the IFOA, again, which I was part of, contributed. So I'm not being comprehensive here. I'm not trying to be. There was lots of other good work going on by actuaries from the Government Actuaries Department, from the IFOA's COVID Action Task Force. So I'm sticking to the bits where I had personal involvement and first-hand experience. There is a more detailed session on Thursday, which will talk through some of the different actuarial groups that were involved in the UK's pandemic response. So anyone that's interested can join that. So if we can move to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about the COVID-19 Actuaries Response Group. So that's a team mostly of actuaries, but also public health experts, epidemiologists, so both social and medical epidemiologists, catastrophists, a job title I particularly love, you know, experts in catastrophe modelling. And we came together very early on. So it was March 2020 when the group formed. I had been starting to put information out into the public domain. So my own views on really what was likely to happen. So simple modelling, projecting, likely projection of cases and so on. And I was contacted by Tan Sui Che, who's then president-elect of the IFOA. And we talked and you know, came to a conclusion that we should get a team of people together. So I reached out essentially to to other experts, many of whom I'd come across in my professional career. And we formed a team and started working together very quickly, formed some brief terms of reference. We were really clear that things were going to move at pace. We were going to be about being responsive. The R in the ARG is about responsiveness, not research. So we were keen to communicate very clearly, to be open about what we know, what we don't know, and what we think nobody knows, and to try and be clear about those different factors. We weren't entirely sure where we would focus our efforts, but we found a niche early on in addressing misinformation. As time went on, I found within mainstream media, certainly my experience in the UK and parts of the international media that I've followed, I found have become better at going to the right experts for the right things. There's less outrageously bad forecasts and misunderstandings happening in mainstream media than there were at the very start. But we got quite involved in bits of misinformation busting early on. We mostly had a UK focus, but we looked for other countries where there would be things we could learn from, where people were doing things differently, and we could potentially compare and contrast. We had a member in South Africa, and I had a number of South Africa-focused bulletins, and we also built links with other actuarial teams around the world. So we republished the work of the COVID-19 mortality working group, so the excellent work that was going on by Australian actuaries, and there were other groups around the world we worked with. The team got great recognition. I was overwhelmed actually by the level of support we got from within the actuarial profession. I think it's fair to say we had a fairly significant impact that's been recognised. We were delighted to be recognised with a President's Award from the IFOA, and also Insurance ERM gave us the Judges Award for contribution to industry. I've highlighted on the screen here an example of an early bulletin. Now, this I think is quite a good example because it's fairly typical of our way of working, and allows us to make a few different points. So this was turned around very, very quickly. I think from deciding that we were going to do this, it was probably around 12 hours to write it, to check it, to get it peer reviewed and then published. So there was definitely a degree of pace. And what we did was we broke down the deaths that we'd seen in the UK between the vaccine priority groups that had been determined. So essentially, the UK approach to the vaccine rollout was to focus on individual risk rather than looking at some of those sort of unproven benefits about breaking chains of transmission. So having done that, we calculated essentially that there were around 88% of the deaths in the first 4 priority groups, around 99% of the deaths in the first 9 priority groups. And the last step that we took was essentially turning what was basically a set of statistics. We knew that there were well-known politicians in the UK who weren't necessarily at their best when dealing with percentages. So we turned the ratio upside down. We rather than talking about risks and likelihood of deaths in individual groups, we turned it essentially into a resource allocation problem. How many vaccines does it take to save one life in these different groups? And actually, that was really successful and really impactful. And we were complimented. I understand. I was contacted by the Department for Health and Social Care saying that the Prime Minister was quoting this paper very widely. and it was called out on one of the national bulletins by our Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty. So if we could move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the use of technology and different communication channels. So a lot of our work actually flowed from Twitter. You know, that was something we started using very early on, and we had a degree of success with it. You know, we didn't necessarily have a plan about how we were going to put things out. We created a website. We also were using LinkedIn early on, and we found LinkedIn was very good for you know, meeting other actuaries and talking to others with the same expertise as us. But in terms of having a more multidisciplinary approach and being able to liaise with other groups of experts, we found Twitter to be much more effective. And there was a lot of other media work flowed from this. So, you know, we were able to get involved with more or less a radio show, made several appearances on there talking about statistics in plain English. But much of the other traditional media flowed from Twitter. That was our mechanism, if you like, for reaching out to journalists, making contact with them, and then being able to get them to disseminate our work. A good example of being able to address some misinformation using social media in real time flowed from some statistics that we saw about mortality rates. So there was a lot of misinformation circulating on Twitter, and there was a chart which was showing mortality rates at double the mortality rates for vaccinated people at double the rate of the unvaccinated. Caused a significant concern. First assumption actually was that it was a complete fabrication, but actually this turned out to be real data by the Office for National Statistics. And with a little bit of investigation, we were able to apply the actuarial skill set and tease out what was really going on. So the first thing we noticed was that this is death rates for an unusual and very broad age band. So it was people aged 10 to 59. Now, that really matters because mortality increases very steeply with age. And because of the timing, so this was in 2021, we're sort of midway through the vaccine rollout, we were in a situation where the vaccine uptake in the UK was very good and very strongly associated with individual risk. So we were in a situation where most of the older people, where risks are high, were vaccinated, and most of the young people, where risks are low, were unvaccinated. So actually what this chart was doing was comparing the risk of a load of teenagers who had not been vaccinated with the risk of a load of people in their sort of 40s and 50s who had. And we know that vaccines make a huge difference to reducing individual risk, but actually age is the strongest predictor of mortality. And so, you know, we were able to come up with a visually compelling way of producing the tweet so that it would spread, because actually trying to you know, keep up with the spread of misinformation can be challenging. And then the other more traditional media helped us echo that. I'll move on. If I can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the CMI, the Continuous Mortality Investigation. So this is another actuarial group. Now, this one has a bit of a longer history than the Actuaries Response Group. CMI will celebrate its 100th birthday next year. Now, the CMI was putting out quarterly mortality monitors ahead of the pandemic, and I'm involved in the CMI and as deputy chair currently. So we pivoted to putting out as well weekly bulletins, which additionally were aimed at the broader public and would allow us to track excess deaths. Now, this was a clear improvement on the official statistics being produced by the Office for National Statistics. Couple of reasons. Firstly, they were using a sort of rolling 5-year average. Doesn't work very well because death rates tend to fall over time. Secondly, they weren't using age standardized mortality in these weekly updates. So we were able to really add value there with the actuarial skill set. So the CMI has been involved in various different things. It recently submitted an update to the COVID inquiry on mortality through the course of the pandemic. And the reports that CMI has been producing have been very, very informative in helping us understand excess deaths and understand which groups have been most affected by excess deaths at different stages of the pandemic. And sadly, we've had around 175,000 excess deaths now in the UK, of which more than 20,000 have been registered this year. If we could move to my last slide, I just want to talk a little bit about the formal pandemic response. So actuaries were involved there too. So I was invited to join a meeting of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergency, SAGE, in the summer of 2020. I was really pleased actually to find out that other actuaries were already involved. So the Government Actuaries Department were already doing good work there. And actually, there was little I could add. Was my view to that review of the first draft, but it did allow me to build those relationships with those involved in the formal response. And actually, we put together a team of volunteers that could support them in different ways. And one of the things we supported was the next iteration of that paper. So we did 2 sub-projects. One was modelling the impact of long COVID. Another was modelling what would happen in the event that hospitals became overwhelmed. So there were lots of decisions being made. This was ahead of the second wave. And so we essentially modelled, how much mortality would rise if people weren't able to get the treatments they needed. We were also able to do early reviews of the work that was being put together, be a kind of critical friend, read early drafts before they went to SAGE and onwards, and provide input and feedback, and help the team who were under considerable time pressure with rapid responses to media and political queries. So if there was a question came up saying, "Oh, are we only seeing excess deaths because there was a couple of years of low flu deaths immediately prior to the pandemic? Is it just a sort of natural swing back?" And we were able to quickly analyse that and say, no, that doesn't stack up. So lots of different ways we were able to get involved. Hopefully that gives you a good flavour of them. So I will stop there and rejoin you for Q&A in due course. Thank you.
Can I ask Maia Gould? She's raring to go. So.
Thank you, Nick. And I'm going to start also by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney and paying my respects to elders past and present. I think my opening gambit is a good segue from Nick's talk. So the COVID-19 pandemic was more than a health crisis. It was a social experiment on a global scale. It did not just stretch hospital systems, but the very fabric of our economy and society. In this sense, it was a challenge of multiple intersecting systems. Disruption to supply chains, remember toilet paper, revealing the brittleness in just-in-time logistics, conspiracies about vaccines and governments, even the seemingly unconnected QAnon conspiracy movement, revealing the cracks in trust in our societies. We're all still searching for a way to make sense of it all. That's a big task, and it's not over yet, even though we are collectively breathing a sigh of relief that we've gotten this far. So how can we learn from this experience? How can we use this information to help us tackle similar things in the future better? There's no one answer to this, but one thing is for sure, it's going to need a multitude of different approaches. I was privileged to be part of the group at the Australian National University that in January 2021 established the new School of Cybernetics. We're co-located with Computing and Engineering, which should tell you something about our focus. we have the ambitious goal of making cybernetics a household word again. As you know, Hitesh had to look it up. And we've got a long way to go. We're still at the stage of every time we stand up needing to tell people what we mean by cybernetics. For this audience of actuaries, the story of cybernetics might be near to your hearts. Cybernetics is an old idea from Greek philosophy. It relates to the notion of steering and human control of technological and environmental systems around us. The man who invented it for the modern era, this guy, at a time when the rise of computing, robotics and automation made it all the more relevant, was Norbert Wiener. Norbert was an American mathematician and a child prodigy, graduating from mathematics at Tufts at the tender age of 14. Perhaps Norbert's name takes many of you back to your university days, studying stochastic process. I didn't study computational statistics, so I found Wiener later, when I was no longer able to fathom the complexity of Brownian motions and random walks. But his mathematical fascination with prediction led him to theorise cybernetics, the scientific study of control and communication in the animal and the machine. The Macy's conferences on cybernetics ran from the late 1940s to the early 1950s and brought people from many different disciplines together to discuss the role of new technology, especially computers and data, in our lives. As well as the mathematicians, there were anthropologists, behavioural scientists, psychologists and engineers. Norbert's cybernetics expanded through this interaction with people from different places and points of view. And looking back from today, cybernetics pops up time and again across the last 80 years in control engineering, climate systems modelling, design thinking and management science. Those original Macy's attendees, through a series of iterative conversations, came to see the world in terms of feedback loops of biological, technical and human systems. The Macy conferences, in fact, popularised the concept of feedback. Prior to this point, the word feedback was only associated with observations in electrical engineering. Feedback is a simple and powerful concept. At its core, it is the idea that the output of a system is also its future input. Seen in this way, feedback is a process that enables prediction. The COVID pandemic highlighted feedback loops driven by things like lockdown rules, release of information about vaccines, new waves, and the efficacy of preventative policies like mask wearing. And we saw different kinds of experts and data playing their part in influencing these, as we've heard from the previous speakers. The pandemic made visible dynamic and adaptive systems, laying bare just how quickly things can change. As we move forward in our hyper-connected world where the impact of actions is felt far from where they are enacted, we will see and need to deal with many more such systems. Communication and control remain important concepts in cybernetics as the forces driving feedback loops. They represent the flow of information and action. We communicate information and through that hope to control, or at least influence, action on the part of others. For example, a leader might address the media every day to update information on the emerging pandemic, seeking to prompt a range of actions on the part of citizens. These might include encouraging vaccination and mask wearing or compliance with lockdowns. It is easy to oversimplify the mechanisms of communication and control and consider them in a step-by-step manner. A leads to B leads to C. In this example, A, decide what action you need citizens to take. B, work out what information will most rationally prompt this action. C, share this information in a timely manner via the broadest reaching channels from the most trustworthy person, a leader. But the reality turned out to be much messier. We found that people got their information from a range of different places, including, most prominently, each other and via social media platforms. And they trusted people and institutions differently. The role of data collection, modelling and communication in the pandemic was to promote good decision-making, and the efforts of groups like the COVID-19 Actuaries response group that Stuart described were critical to this. However, this was not the only information out there. The flow of information during the pandemic was at a scale not seen before. The proliferation of false information accelerated at a greater rate than true information. Many observers at the time reflected that it is easier and faster to create and distribute lies than it is to gather the evidence for considered truths. So how do we counteract this situation where false information is more readily available than true? The first step is awareness. We need to know that it is happening and where. Understanding the behaviour of different groups of people and what happens when they come into contact with each other, especially in technology-mediated ways, is key to more accurate prediction. And this might mean collecting different data, linking data sets, or doing things differently with the insights derived from data. I've been talking about the flow of information and action in society and reflecting that key concepts include feedback, plurality, and connections. Now we turn to another concept, which is that all of this is governed by what different stakeholders in society hope to achieve. And now Nick didn't say this because he didn't read out his perfectly formed speech over here, but I'm sure you got it from what he was saying. All this depends on what your idea of success is in a pandemic. Power and politics always play a role, as do fundamental drivers of human behaviour, such as the need to belong, to keep secrets, to gain status, to feel safe. When people don't behave in the way you expect as a result of your very rational transmission of information and requests for action, it is worth pausing to consider whether there are hidden and competing agendas at play. The COVID pandemic laid bare the competing agendas of different groups in our societies. As governments tested out the seams of the trust fabric of society, we saw cracks appear time and again. Different agendas were pitted against one another every day. The personal risk in having a vaccine, however small that risk is pitted daily against the social need to increase vaccination levels to create herd immunity. A story that stands out from the pandemic in my memory is a friend's encounter with someone who shouted at him to take his mask off. He tried calmly to tell this person, "My mask protects you and your mask protects me." Well, this can only be true in a trusting society, a society of aligned agendas, a high synergy society. Aligning agendas to create a high synergy society is not an easy task, and it is a job for all of us. It's harder and harder to break out of our echo chambers, but as both the good and the bad of the pandemic showed, it's all the more important. So cybernetics gives us a way of thinking clearly about big, hairy, society-wide challenges. With concepts like feedback, plurality, connections, and synergy, we can start to pull apart what has happened in the past, what led us there, and how we might think of a different path moving forward. I look forward to a lively panel with this very excellent group of people who contributed to society so much during the pandemic and continue to do so today. Thank you.
Thank you, Maia.